The air in the Blackwood ballroom was a thick, gilded thing, heavy with the scent of beeswax, wilting roses, and the unvoiced ambitions of half the peerage. Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood, stood near a Corinthian column, the marble cool against her gloved fingers. She had been standing there for 7 minutes, a duration she measured by the stately progress of the second hand on the ormolu clock across the room. It was a habit of hers, this silent counting. It imposed order on chaos. From this vantage, she could see most of the room, the dancers spinning like jeweled tops, the dowagers lining the walls like vultures in silk, and her husband, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, standing near the French doors that led to the gardens. He was not alone. He was with Lady Isabel Vance. Of course he was. Lady Isabel was a masterpiece of curated vibrancy, all gleaming auburn hair and a laugh that was just a half note too loud to be truly elegant, which was precisely its charm. She was the sort of woman men watched. Alistair was watching her now, his head inclined, a smile on his face that Eleanor had not seen directed at her since the first week of their marriage, 2 years ago. It was a genuine smile, unguarded and alive, and it made him look younger than his 30 years. It made him look like a stranger. Eleanor smoothed a fold in her silver-gray satin gown. The dress was a statement of quiet dignity, chosen to be unimpeachable and unremarkable. It was the uniform of her position. On her throat, the Blackwood diamonds felt less like jewels and more like a yoke, each stone a cold, heavy reminder of the contract that bound her to the man by the gardens. They had been his mother's, and his grandmother's before that. They were meant to signify belonging. Tonight, they felt like the price of it. She knew what was coming. She had a preternatural sense for the precise moment when Alistair's public discretion would fail him. It was a matter of mathematics. The amount of champagne consumed, multiplied by the intensity of Lady Isabel's gaze, divided by the number of witnesses he deemed insignificant. The calculation was reaching its sum. He leaned in, his hand coming up to cup Lady Isabel's jaw. Her eyes fluttered shut. The kiss was not chaste. It was not a fleeting peck on the cheek. It was a deliberate, lingering claiming, performed under the blaze of 1,000 candles for anyone who cared to look. And everyone cared to look. A wave of silence radiated outward from the French doors, a ripple of shock that stilled the dancers and quieted the chatter. Fans paused mid-flutter, heads turned. Every eye in the room found the Duke, then his mistress, and then, inevitably, his wife. Eleanor felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure. They were waiting for the performance. They expected tears, a swoon, a dramatic exit. They expected the Duchess to play her part in the sordid little drama her husband had authored. Eleanor did not move. She kept her hand resting on the cool marble of the column, her posture unchanged. She watched the tableau for one more beat, cataloging the details. The possessive curve of Alistair's fingers on Isabel's skin, the triumphant little smile that played on Isabel's lips when he finally drew back, the flicker of defiance in Alistair's eyes as he belatedly scanned the room, his gaze sliding right past his wife as if she were part of the decor. He did not see her. He never truly did. She felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. It was the clarity that follows a lightning strike after the world has been split open by a blinding white light. The pain was there, a deep, resonant ache behind her ribs, but it was an old pain. Tonight had simply given it a name and a face. This was not a betrayal. A betrayal required a prior trust. This was merely a confirmation of terms. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor raised her chin. She allowed a small, polite smile to touch her lips. It was a smile she had perfected, one that conveyed nothing beyond a serene and distant courtesy. It was the smile she gave to tradesmen and visiting dignitaries. It did not reach her eyes. Her eyes, cool and grey as a winter sea, met the curious stare of the Countess of Abernathy, who stood nearby. Eleanor gave the barest of nods, a gesture of dismissal. Then, with a quiet rustle of satin, she turned. She did not hurry. Her steps were measured, her spine straight. She walked away from the column, away from the silent, watching crowd, and toward the grand staircase. She did not look back. Each step was a silent declaration. You have all witnessed the insult. Now, you will witness my response. And my response is to be elsewhere. The weight of the Blackwood diamonds seemed to lessen with every step she took toward the door. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a state of suspended animation. Eleanor sat alone in the ducal carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather straps the only sounds. She watched the rolling hills of Kent slide by, the landscape rendered in shades of grey and green by the pale morning light. She had not slept. She had simply instructed her maid, a quiet girl named Jane, to pack a trunk for an extended stay in the country, and they had departed London before the city was fully awake. No note was left for the Duke. A note would imply an expectation of a reply, and Eleanor expected nothing. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist as they approached, a formidable pile of grey stone and mullioned windows. It was a house that did not welcome. It endured. It had stood for 300 years, weathering storms both meteorological and dynastic. Alistair preferred their London residence, the polished heart of his social and political life. He had not visited the manor in over a year, leaving it to the care of a steward, Mr. Croft, a man whose reports were always brief and reassuringly vague. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was waiting on the steps as the carriage drew to a halt. She was a tall, spare woman whose 60 years were etched into a face that had the severe beauty of a Roman coin. She had served Alistair's mother, and her loyalty was to the house itself, not to its temporary occupants. Her gaze was sharp and missed nothing. She took in the Duchess's solitary arrival, the single trunk, the exhaustion that lay like a fine dust over her mistress's features. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low and without surprise. She curtsied, a crisp, economical movement. "We were not expecting you." "My plans changed, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor said, her own voice sounding thin in the damp air. "I find I am in need of the country." "The country is always here," the housekeeper replied, a statement of fact that carried a strange comfort. "I will have the Rose Suite prepared." The Rose Suite was the Duchess's traditional quarter, a series of rooms that overlooked a garden long since given over to weeds. It was filled with heavy, dark furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. It felt like a beautifully appointed tomb. Eleanor spent the first day there, not resting, but walking from room to room, touching the dusty surfaces, peering through the grimy window panes. The house felt neglected, breathing a shallow, dusty sigh of abandonment. It mirrored the state of her own heart. On the second day, she requested the estate ledgers. Mrs. Gable brought them to her in the small morning room. They were heavy, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with Mr. Croft's spidery, self-satisfied script. Eleanor opened the first one. She had not told her husband, or indeed anyone in his family, that her father, a simple country baronet with more land than sense, had insisted she learn the practical arts of estate management. "A woman who can read a balance sheet," he had often said, "is a woman who cannot be easily cheated." He had taught her about crop rotation, tenant contracts, drainage, and the unforgiving logic of numbers. It was a deeply unfashionable education for a young lady, but it had been the language of love between her and her father. She began to read. It took her less than an hour to understand the depth of the problem. Mr. Croft's reports were works of fiction. The numbers were illusions, columns of hopeful projections and deferred expenses. Rents were in arrears. Necessary repairs to tenant farms had been ignored for years, and the home farm was losing money at a staggering rate. The estate was not sleeping. It was bleeding out, slowly and silently. A cold fury, clean and sharp, cut through the fog of her personal grief. This was Alistair's heritage, his responsibility, and he was letting it crumble through sheer, arrogant neglect. He was in London, playing the Grand Duke, while the foundation of his wealth and title rotted beneath his feet. She closed the ledger, a fine layer of dust coating her fingertips. She looked out the window at the overgrown garden. A single, stubborn rose was climbing a crumbling stone wall, its pale pink blooms a small defiance against the decay. That afternoon, she sent a message to Mr. Croft, summoning him to the estate office. It was a room Alistair had never used, lined with bookshelves of agricultural treatises and rolled maps. Eleanor sat behind the large mahogany desk, the ledgers spread before her. She did not wear jewels or fine silks, but a simple day dress of dark blue wool. When the steward entered, a portly man with a perpetually florid face, he looked surprised to see her there, in that seat of power. "Your Grace," he began, a wheezing, obsequious sound. "An unexpected pleasure." "Mr. Croft," Eleanor said, her voice perfectly level. She did not invite him to sit. "I have been reviewing the estate accounts." She tapped a page in the open ledger. "You will explain to me the discrepancy between the projected income from the North Fields and the actual receipts for the past 4 quarters. The man's face paled. He stammered, launching into a convoluted explanation involving unseasonable rains and tenant sloth. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he was finished, she looked at him, her gray eyes holding no warmth. "The discrepancy," she said, her voice as quiet and precise as the cut of a diamond, "is incompetence. Or it is theft. I have not yet decided which. You will bring me every account book, every tenant agreement, and every bill of sale for the last 5 years. You will have them on this desk by morning. You are dismissed." Mr. Croft stared, his mouth agape. He had never been spoken to this way, certainly not by the Duke's quiet, ornamental wife. He saw something in her face then, a cool, unyielding strength he had not imagined she possessed. He turned and left without another word. Eleanor remained at the desk long after he was gone, the late afternoon light slanting through the dusty windows. She had discovered a purpose here, in this neglected corner of her life. Her marriage was a ruin. But this house, this land, this was something she could save. She would work. She would restore order. She would build something from the ashes. And she would do it alone. It was not the life she had imagined, but it would be a life of her own making. In London, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, was finding life to be unexpectedly vexing. Eleanor's departure had, at first, been a relief. He had braced himself for a storm of tears and recriminations, a domestic battle that would have been tedious and undignified. Her silent exit was, he told himself, a mark of her usual passivity. He imagined her sulking in the country, writing mournful letters to her mother, and assumed she would return within a fortnight, chastened and ready to resume her duties as the silent partner in their public arrangement. But a fortnight passed, and then a month, and no letter arrived. The ducal residence on Grosvenor Square felt cavernous and unnervingly quiet. Her absence was a tangible thing. He noticed it in the way the household staff seemed more tense, in the perfect, undisturbed order of her drawing room, a room he never entered, but whose closed door now seemed like a silent accusation. He found himself listening for the soft rustle of her skirts in the hall, the quiet click of her door closing at night. These were sounds he had never consciously registered before, and their absence was a constant, low-level irritant. Lady Isabel Vance did her best to fill the silence. She was more present than ever, her laughter echoing in the halls, her vibrant silks a slash of color against the somber elegance of his home. She was beautiful, witty, and uncomplicatedly admiring. She was everything he had once thought he wanted. Yet he found her company increasingly grating. Her chatter seemed frivolous, her demands for his attention tiresome. She would complain about a rival's new jewels or a slight at a soiree, and he would find his mind drifting to an image of his wife's face, her calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything and say nothing. "Alistair, you are not listening to me," Isabel pouted one afternoon, tapping his arm with her fan. They were in his study, a sanctuary she had invaded with her feathered hats and bottles of scent. "My apologies," he said, turning from the window where he had been staring at nothing. "I have matters of business on my mind." "Business is so dreadfully dull," she sighed. "Let us ride in the park. You must show off your new greys, and I shall wear my new habit. We will make everyone positively sick with envy." He looked at her, at the calculated perfection of her smile, the acquisitive gleam in her eyes, and felt a profound weariness. He had kissed her at the ball out of a sense of defiance, a public declaration that he would not be bound by the cold constraints of his arranged marriage. He had meant to assert his freedom, but looking at Isabel now, he felt more trapped than ever. The affair had become another duty, another set of expectations to be managed. The first real crack in his self-assurance came in the form of a letter from his solicitor. Mr. Abernathy was a dry, methodical man, not given to alarmism. The letter, however, was stark. It spoke of significant financial irregularities on the Blackwood estate and an alarming shortfall in quarterly revenues. It concluded with a recommendation for His Grace's immediate and personal attention. Alistair read it twice, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach. He had always taken his wealth for granted. The Blackwood fortune was ancient and, he had assumed, inexhaustible. He paid men like Mr. Croft to handle the tedious details, so that he could focus on politics and the far more interesting business of living. He sent a curt, angry letter to Croft, demanding an immediate explanation. The reply, when it came a week later, was not from Croft. It was from Eleanor. Her letter was a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting was as clear and elegant as she was. There was no preamble, no mention of their personal situation. It was a document of pure, unadorned fact. "Your Grace, I have dismissed Mr. Croft from his position. An audit of the estate accounts revealed a pattern of embezzlement and gross mismanagement extending over the past 3 years. I have engaged a new steward, a Mr. Davies, recommended by Lord Ashworth's man of business. I have also renegotiated the tenancy agreements for the North Farms and authorised the funds for the long-overdue drainage of the East Meadow. A full report of my actions and the summary of the current financial state of the estate are enclosed. Your wife, Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood." He stared at the letter, his mind struggling to process the information. Dismissed Croft? An audit? Negotiated tenancies? It was absurd. Eleanor's interests, as far as he knew, were limited to needlepoint and French poetry. She was a quiet, biddable woman whom he had married for her respectable lineage and substantial dowry, a dowry he now suspected might have been propping up his finances more than he knew. He had never once considered that she might possess a mind for business. He unfolded the enclosed report. It was 10 pages long, filled with columns of figures, concise summaries of crop yields, and detailed proposals for future investments. It was more thorough and insightful than anything Croft had ever produced. It was the work of someone who understood land, money, and men. A cold realization washed over him. While he had been preening in London society, his ornamental wife had been quietly saving him from ruin. The thought was so deeply unsettling, so completely contrary to the world as he knew it, that he felt a sudden, urgent need to see it for himself. He needed to go to Blackwood Manor. He needed to see what she had done. And he needed, though he would not admit it to himself, to see her. The drive to Blackwood felt different this time. Before, it had been a journey toward tedious duty. Now, it was a journey into the unknown. He arrived unannounced on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. As his carriage rolled up the drive, he noticed the changes immediately. The gravel was freshly raked. The great oak doors at the entrance had been polished to a deep, dark sheen. The brass knocker gleamed. The house no longer looked abandoned. It looked awake. Mrs. Gable met him at the door. Her expression was, as always, unreadable. "Your Grace," she said, her tone neutral. "Mrs. Gable, where is the Duchess?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Her Grace is in the estate office," the housekeeper replied, a faint, almost imperceptible emphasis on the word office. She led him through the halls, which were cleaner and brighter than he remembered. The scent of beeswax had replaced the smell of dust. The estate office was at the back of the house, a room he had entered perhaps twice in his life. The door was ajar. He paused on the threshold, unseen. Eleanor was not at the desk. She was standing before a large map of the estate pinned to the wall, in discussion with a sturdy, weather-beaten man in his 40s, whom Alistair assumed was the new steward, Davies. Eleanor's back was to the door. She was wearing a simple gray dress, her dark hair pinned up in a neat, practical chignon. She gestured toward a section of the map, her finger tracing the line of a river. "If we divert the water here, Mr. Davies," she was saying, her voice clear and confident, "we can irrigate the lower pasture. It will be costly in the short term, but the yield should double within 2 seasons. We can use the timber from the West Wood to pay for the initial labor." "A sound plan, Your Grace," the steward said, his respect for her evident in his tone. "I'll draw up the estimates." Alistair stood frozen in the doorway, a spectator in his own home. This was not the timid, silent woman he had married. This was a commander, a strategist. He had thought her world was the drawing room. He found her here, redrawing the map of his own lands. She had taken the heart of his power, the source of his wealth, and was managing it with a competence he had never bothered to acquire himself. He must have made a sound because she turned. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but her composure was absolute. The cool, distant calm was back in her face. "Alistair," she said, her use of his given name a surprise. She corrected herself immediately. "Your Grace, we were not aware you were arriving today." It was a statement, not a question. "I came to see for myself," he said, stepping into the room. It felt like her territory now, not his. The air was charged with the unfamiliar dynamic. He was the master of the house, yet he felt like an intruder. Mr. Davies, sensing the tension, gave a brief bow. "Your Grace, Duchess, if you'll excuse me." He slipped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. They were alone. The silence stretched between them, thick with 2 years of unspoken words and one very public insult. Alistair looked from the map to the ledgers on the desk, then to his wife. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, waiting. She was not angry, not tearful, not accusatory. She was simply waiting for him to speak. For the first time, he had no idea what to say to her.
"The solicitor wrote to me," he began, his voice stiff. "He indicated there were problems."
"There were," she confirmed. "I have taken steps to address them."
"So I see."
He gestured vaguely at the map.
"You seem to have taken charge."
A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of warmth, but of dry, painful irony. "Someone had to," she said quietly. The simple sentence landed like a blow. It was not an accusation, but a plain statement of fact, and for that reason, it was more damning than any tirade. He had failed in his most fundamental duty as Duke, and she, the wife he had ignored and humiliated, had shouldered his burden. He felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a surge of defensive anger.
"You should have informed me," he said, falling back on the familiar cadence of command.
"These are my lands, my decisions." Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "As I recall," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm, "you were otherwise engaged in London, and the decisions needed to be made." There was no answer to that. She was right. He had been engaged in a frivolous, destructive affair, while his birthright withered from neglect. He looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He saw the faint shadows of fatigue under her eyes, but he also saw a strength in her posture, a clarity in her gaze that was entirely new to him. Or perhaps it had been there all along, and he had simply been too blind to see it. He had married a shadow and come home to find a queen. The realization left him utterly adrift. The days that followed were a study in strained civility. Alastair did not return to London. He could not.
To leave now would be to abdicate entirely, to admit that she was more capable of being the Duke of Blackwood than he was.
So he stayed, a ghost at the feast of his own life, watching as his wife managed his affairs with an efficiency that was both admirable and deeply emasculating. They ate their meals together in the vast, silent dining room. The conversation was stilted, confined to the neutral territory of the estate. He would ask about the new steward. She would provide a concise summary of the man's qualifications. She would inquire if he had reviewed the proposal for the new mill. He would confirm that he had, offering a minor suggestion that she would consider with a polite, non-committal nod. They were like two diplomats from warring nations, negotiating a treaty one clause at a time. He began to follow her. Not in a deliberate, spying way, but he found his daily path intersecting with hers. He would go for a ride and see her in the distance, walking the fields with Mr.
Davies, her dark cloak a stark figure against the muted autumn landscape.
He would descend for breakfast to find her already in the estate office, a candle lit against the morning gloom, her head bent over a column of figures. He observed her interactions with the staff and tenants. They treated her with a profound, quiet respect. They brought their disputes to her, their requests, their worries. She listened patiently, asked sharp, insightful questions, and rendered judgments that were both fair and final. She was the center of this world, and he was merely in its orbit. One evening, unable to face another silent dinner, he went to the estate office after the house had grown quiet. He told himself he wanted to review the quarterly accounts. He found her there, as he knew he would. She was sitting at the desk, not working, but reading a small, worn book. A single lamp cast a warm pool of light around her, softening the severe lines of her face.
She looked up as he entered, her expression unguarded for a brief moment.
He saw not a duchess or an estate manager, but a woman, tired and lonely. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You are not," she replied, closing the book and placing it aside. "I was finished for the day." He gestured to the chair opposite the desk. "May I?" She nodded. He sat, the great mahogany desk a barrier between them. He wanted to speak of what had happened at the ball, to offer some kind of explanation, an apology. But the words felt cheap and inadequate. How could he apologize for an act when the true crime was the years of careless disregard that led to it? Instead, he asked, "What were you reading?" She seemed surprised by the personal question. She hesitated, then slid the book across the desk toward him. It was a slim volume of poetry. Marcus Aurelius, The Meditations. An odd choice for a lady. He opened it. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, small, neat annotations in the margins. "My father gave it to me," she said, her voice quiet. "He said a stoic mind was the best defense against the disappointments of the world." "Has it been effective?" Alistair asked, the question more pointed than he intended. Her gaze met his across the desk. For the first time, he saw a flicker of the pain he had inflicted. It was a brief, quickly suppressed thing, but it was there. "It has its uses," she said. "It teaches one to distinguish between what can be controlled and what cannot." The implication hung in the air between them. He was what she could not control. His infidelities, his neglect, his public humiliation of her. She had simply absorbed it, contained it, and turned her energies to what she could control. This house, this land. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like admiration. "Eleanor," he began, the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. "About the ball." She held up a hand, a small, quiet gesture that nonetheless stopped him cold. "There is nothing to be said, Your Grace. The past is fixed. It is like a sum in a ledger. It can be acknowledged, but it cannot be changed. I am more concerned with the accounts of the future." She stood then, a clear dismissal. "I am tired, if you will excuse me." He watched her leave the room, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She had not let him apologize. She had not given him the relief of confession. She had simply rendered his feelings irrelevant. He sat alone in the office, the book of Stoic philosophy lying on the desk before him. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering of the title. He had come here to reassert his authority, to put his house back in order. He was beginning to understand that the most profound disorder was not in his accounts, but in himself. And the only person who could show him how to fix it was the woman he had so thoroughly broken. The winter was a long, quiet siege. Snowfall muffled the world, isolating Blackwood Manor from the distant clamor of London. For Alistair, it was a period of forced introspection. He had nowhere to go and nothing to do but watch his wife. He learned her routines, the early mornings in the office, the brisk afternoon walks she took regardless of the weather, the evenings spent reading by the fire in the small library. He learned the language of her silences. He began to see the subtle shifts in her expression that he had previously missed. The slight furrow of her brow when she was wrestling with a problem, the faint softening of her mouth when Mrs. Gable brought her a cup of tea, the deep, abiding melancholy in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. He tried to help, to involve himself in the running of the estate. At first she resisted, her politeness a formidable shield. She would listen to his suggestions and thank him for his input, then calmly continue with her own, better-informed plans. But he was persistent. He began to read the agricultural treatises in the office library. He spent time with Mr. Davies, walking the frozen fields and learning the names and histories of the tenant families. He was clumsy at it, his ignorance a constant source of private humiliation, but he did not stop. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. Eleanor began to leave certain documents on his side of the desk. She started to ask for his opinion on matters of law or politics as they affected the estate. One afternoon, she unrolled a map detailing a long-running border dispute with their neighbor, Sir John Everard.
"Sir John is a bully," she said, her tone purely practical. "He has moved his fences 6 feet onto our land along the riverbank. My letters have been ignored. You have more experience in dealing with men of his temperament. What would you suggest?" It was the first time she had explicitly acknowledged that he possessed a skill she did not. It was a small opening, a crack in the wall of her self-sufficiency. Alistair felt a surge of purpose. He handled Sir John. It did not require shouting or threats, but a carefully worded letter to a mutual acquaintance in Parliament, a quiet leveraging of his ducal power that resulted in the fences being moved back within a week. When he told Eleanor it was done, she gave him a small, genuine nod of approval. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple phrase, but for Alistair, it felt like a monumental victory. They began to work together, side by side in the office, for hours each day. The vast desk was no longer a barrier, but a shared workspace. They developed a rhythm, a quiet partnership, built on the neutral language of accounts and land management. Through this shared work, he began to see the woman he had married. He saw her sharp, analytical mind, her deep sense of justice in her dealings with the tenants, her quiet determination. He saw the subtle humor that occasionally surfaced in a dry comment about a pompous letter or a ridiculous request. One evening, a fierce blizzard descended, trapping them in the house. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. They were in the library, a fire roaring in the hearth. For once, they were not working. A comfortable silence had fallen between them. Alistair found himself watching her as she read, the firelight catching the warm tones in her dark hair. He was struck by her beauty, a quiet, intelligent beauty he had never taken the time to appreciate. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her finger marking her place in her book.
"Yes?"
"Why did you marry me?" he asked. The question had been haunting him for weeks. He knew why he had married her. Duty, dowry, convenience. He had never considered her reasons. She looked into the fire, her expression thoughtful. "My father was ill," she said softly. "His estate was entailed away from the female line. He wanted to see me secure. You were a duke. It was considered a brilliant match." She paused. "And I thought, I hoped, that we might be able to build a life of mutual respect, that affection might grow from companionship." Her honesty was a blade to the heart. She had come to their marriage with hope, a modest, reasonable hope, and he had systematically crushed it. "I destroyed that possibility," he said. It was not an apology, but a confession. She did not deny it. She simply looked at him, her grey eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness. "You were not the man I thought you were," she said. "But then," she added, a flicker of her dry wit returning, "I was not the woman you thought I was either." He let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "No, you were not." The conversation ended there, but it left a permanent change in the atmosphere between them. He had acknowledged his failure, and she had acknowledged his blindness. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a foundation. A few days later, a letter arrived from London, bearing Lady Isabel Vance's ostentatious seal. Alistair read it in the hall, his face grim. He then walked to the fireplace, tore the letter in two, and dropped it into the flames. He did not know that Eleanor was standing at the top of the stairs, watching him. She saw the act for what it was, a severing, a final choice. She turned and walked back to her room, a strange, unfamiliar lightness in her chest. The thaw came first to the land, then to the house. As the snows melted, revealing the green shoots of spring, a new energy seemed to permeate Blackwood Manor. The work of the estate moved outdoors, and Alistair and Eleanor with it. They rode out together to inspect the new drainage ditches, to speak with the tenants about the spring planting, to oversee the repairs to the mill. They were a familiar sight now, the Duke and his Duchess working in tandem. The estate began to heal, to prosper under their joint care. The change in their relationship was just as gradual, just as organic. The long hours of shared work had forged a bond of respect between them. The formal "Your Grace" and "Duchess" had given way to Alistair and Eleanor, the names spoken now with a quiet familiarity rather than stiff obligation. They still did not speak of the past, of the wound that lay between them, but its power was diminishing. It was being overlaid with new memories. A shared laugh over a clumsy lamb, a moment of silent agreement as they watched the sun set over their fields, a comfortable quiet as they sat across from each other in the evenings, reading their separate books. One afternoon, a package arrived from London. It was for Eleanor. She opened it in the morning room, Alistair watching from the doorway. Inside was a jeweler's box. She lifted the lid. On a bed of velvet lay a pair of earrings, exquisite pearls surrounded by small, brilliant diamonds. They were elegant and understated, perfectly suited to her taste. There was a small card. Alistair saw her read it, her expression unreadable. "They are from my mother," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A birthday gift." She closed the box. "I should write to thank her." "It is your birthday?" Alistair asked, a feeling of deep shame washing over him. He had not known. In 2 years of marriage, he had never once thought to ask. "Tomorrow," she confirmed, not looking at him. She placed the box on the mantelpiece and left the room. The next day, Alistair was absent for much of the morning. He returned just before luncheon, his horse lathered from a hard ride. He found Eleanor in the garden, the one she had begun to restore. She was kneeling, her gloves covered in soil, carefully tending to the rose bushes that climbed the old stone wall. She looked up as he approached, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He stood before her, his hands behind his back. He felt as awkward as a schoolboy. "I know it is not pearls from London," he began, his voice rough. "But I hoped you might like this." He brought his hand forward. In it, he held a single, perfect, white rose, its petals just beginning to unfurl. He had ridden to the old dower house, a place long abandoned, because he remembered his mother saying the finest roses on the estate grew there. Eleanor stared at the flower, then up at his face. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the genuine hope. It was a simple, foolish gesture. It was not a ducal command or a transaction. It was a gift, freely and thoughtfully given. She slowly pulled off her gardening glove and reached out, her bare fingers brushing his as she took the rose. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She lifted it to her face, inhaling the scent. When she looked back at him, there were tears shimmering in her eyes. They were the first tears he had ever seen her shed. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He had rehearsed 100 grand apologies in his mind, but they all felt false. The truth was simpler. "I am sorry," he said, "for everything. For my blindness, for the man I was. I did not deserve you." She did not say, "I forgive you." She did not offer easy absolution. She simply held the rose and looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. And in that look, he saw not the pain of the past, but the possibility of a future. "No," she said softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "You did not. But perhaps," she added, her eyes holding his, "you are becoming a man who does." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently wiped the smudge of dirt from her cheek. It was the most intimate gesture that had ever passed between them. She did not pull away. In the quiet of the walled garden, surrounded by the promise of new life, something broken began, at last, to mend. The news from London arrived like a summons from a former life. An invitation to the Argyles' spring ball, one of the most significant events of the season, was a clear signal. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood's prolonged absence had been noted, commented upon, and was now being officially questioned. To refuse would be to cede the field, to allow the whispers and rumors about their marriage to solidify into accepted fact. Alistair placed the thick, cream-colored card on the desk in the estate office. "We should go," he said. It was not a command, but a question. Eleanor looked at it, her fingers tracing the elaborate crest. The thought of returning to that world, to the sea of watching eyes and whispered judgments, sent a chill through her. Blackwood Manor had become her sanctuary, a world she had rebuilt on her own terms. London was the site of her greatest humiliation. "Is that what you wish?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "I wish," he said slowly, his voice earnest, "to be seen with my wife, to stand beside you, not as a duke with his duchess, but as a man with the woman he respects." The word love was too large, too unearned to be spoken yet, but respect was a solid, foundational thing. It was the ground they now stood on. "I understand if you do not want to, after what happened." "No," she said, her voice firm, with the decision suddenly made. "You are right. We will go." She would not hide. She had done nothing to be ashamed of. She would return to London not as the victim she had been, but as the woman she had become. The preparations for their return were a quiet statement of their new partnership. They traveled to London together, not in the strained silence of her last departure, but in a comfortable companionship, discussing plans for the estate during the journey. The London house, which had once felt like a gilded cage to Eleanor, now simply felt like a place to reside. Its power over her was broken. The night of the Argyle ball arrived. Eleanor dressed with care. She did not choose a gown of gray or muted tones. She wore a deep emerald green velvet, a color that brought out the warmth in her skin and the cool clarity of her eyes. It was a dress that did not apologize or hide. On her throat, she wore the Blackwood diamonds. She fastened the clasp, her fingers steady. She looked at her reflection. The jewels no longer felt like a cold weight. They felt like a part of her, a symbol of a heritage she had not merely married into, but had actively saved and shaped. They were hers by right of competence. When Alistair came to her rooms to escort her downstairs, he stopped dead in the doorway. He had grown accustomed to seeing her in practical day dresses, her hair simply pinned. Seeing her now, regal and radiant, he was struck dumb. "Eleanor,"
he breathed. You are magnificent.
She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It is merely a dress, Alistair.
No, he said, walking toward her. It is not the dress. He gently took her hand, raising it to his lips. His gaze met hers over her knuckles. It is you. As they entered the Argyle's ballroom, a familiar hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers started. But this time, the dynamic was entirely different. Alistair did not leave her side. His hand rested possessively in the small of her back, a constant, grounding presence. He was not the defiant, careless duke of months before. He was attentive, his focus entirely on his wife, fetching her a glass of champagne, leaning in to murmur a comment in her ear, his pride in her visible to everyone. They saw Lady Isabel Vance across the room. She was holding court, as usual, but her eyes kept straying to them. She looked at Eleanor, at the confidence in her bearing, at the Duke's unwavering attention, and a flicker of something, surprise, defeat, crossed her face. She looked away. She was a ghost from a past that no longer had any power. Later in the evening, as they were standing near the terrace, the Countess of Abernathy approached them, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Duchess," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "You are looking remarkably well. The country air certainly agrees with you." Before Eleanor could reply, Alistair spoke, his voice clear and carrying. "My wife is always remarkable, Countess. It is the rest of us who are finally learning to pay attention." He looked down at Eleanor, a quiet message passing between them. He was publicly correcting the record, atoning for his public sin in the very same arena where it was committed. The Countess, taken aback by his directness, offered a flustered curtsy and retreated. Alistair led Eleanor onto the terrace, away from the heat and noise of the ballroom. The cool night air was a relief. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the sleeping gardens of London. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. "It was the least I could do," he replied. And it was the truth. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. The music from the ballroom drifted out to them, a faint, romantic waltz. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and serious. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, not your forgiveness, and certainly not your affection. But I must tell you, these past months at Blackwood, they have been the most meaningful of my life. You have shown me what it is to have a purpose. You have shown me what it is to have a partner. You have saved my home. You have saved me from myself. I love you. I know I have not earned the right to say it, but it is the truest thing I know." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the gaslights. Her expression was calm, her gray eyes searching his. He saw no triumph there, only a deep, quiet consideration. He had laid his heart bare, and he waited for her judgment. She did not give him a grand declaration in return. Her love, like her strength, was a quieter, more practical thing. She simply raised a hand and gently touched his cheek. Her fingers were cool against his skin. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but sure, "let us go home." Home. He understood. Not to the London house, but to Blackwood, to the place where they had found each other, to the fields and the ledgers and the life they were building together. It was an answer more profound than any impassioned speech. It was an acceptance, a beginning. He covered her hand with his heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time, The kiss was not an act of public defiance or private shame. It was a quiet promise, made under the silent watch of the stars, a seal on a peace that had been so long and so painfully earned.